The air was thick with dust, the kind that stuck to everything, making the world feel heavier than it already was. The war had scarred the land, leaving the once thriving settlement of Juno 4 inches ruins. Buildings had been reduced to rubble, and the sky above, once clear and bright, now looked as though it had been permanently stained with smoke and ash. Captain Jackson Holt squinted against the burning wind as he led his team through the wreckage. His boots crunched over the gravel and broken glass as they moved cautiously through what was left of the city. The mission was simple. Check for enemy presence, scavenge any useful supplies, and head back to the outpost. They were hundreds of miles from home, far from the safety of the colony, but this was their job now. These were the conditions they had to adapt to. Even if it felt like the entire universe had forgotten about places like Juno 4, Jackson wasn't one to complain. He had been through countless missions before, most of them more dangerous than this one, and had seen more death than he cared to admit. His eyes had become hardened by the years, his face permanently set in a grim expression that made it hard for anyone to tell what he was really thinking. As they walked through the decimated streets, his team moved with practiced caution, weapons drawn, scanning every corner, every shadow. They knew the enemy had been spotted in the area, but it was too quiet now, too still. Something didn't sit right with Jackson. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his gut was telling him that danger wasn't far off. Captain, Lieutenant Rachel Kane, his second in command, said quietly as she walked alongside him. Something's wrong. We've been at this for hours, and we haven't seen a damn thing. Jackson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling for the team to stop. They gathered around him in a loose formation, their eyes scanning the surroundings. "We're not alone," Jackson finally muttered, his voice low but firm. Kane frowned. "You think they're watching us?" "Could be," Jackson said. "Stay alert. Eyes up." Just as he finished speaking, a small, high-pitched sound cut through the silence, a child's voice. At first, Jackson thought it was his imagination, but then it came again, softer this time. "Please, someone, help." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. A child? Here? In the middle of a war zone? "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to Kane. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yeah. It's coming from over there," she said, pointing to the remains of a collapsed building up ahead. "Stay sharp," Jackson ordered, as the team moved in that direction. They kept their weapons raised, eyes peeled for any signs of danger. But the closer they got to the source of the voice, the more it sounded like a plea, desperate and weak. Jackson's heart clenched, the thought of a child trapped in this hellish place gnawing at him. They rounded the corner of the ruined building, and that's when Jackson saw her. A girl. She couldn't have been older than 8, with pale skin and wide, terrified eyes. She stood in the shadow of a crumbling wall, her small frame shaking as she clutched something tightly to her chest. At first glance, she looked human, but Jackson's trained eyes caught the subtle differences. Her skin was too smooth, her eyes too large, and her ears were pointed in a way that no human ears could be. She looked up at him, her expression pleading, her lips trembling. Her small hands were holding a small, ragged teddy bear, its fur worn and frayed from whatever journey it had endured. "Please, human," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. "My brother. He hasn't eaten in days. Please. We need help." Jackson's heart sank, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His mind raced. An alien child alone, hungry, and scared. What was she doing here? Was she a scout for the enemy? Was this some kind of trap? His team had already raised their weapons, eyes fixed on the girl. Kane stepped forward, her voice cautious. "Captain, we can't trust her. She could be bait." Jackson shook his head, his eyes never leaving the girl's pleading gaze. "We don't know that for sure. Stay back. Let me talk to her." The girl's eyes flickered to the soldiers behind him, her fear escalating. She clutched the teddy bear tighter to her chest. "Please," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt anyone. My brother. He's dying. He's too weak to move. He needs food. We. The desperation in her voice made Jackson hesitate. He had seen countless horrors during his time on the front lines, but this was something different. This was a child, an innocent, who had somehow found herself caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand. He looked around at his team, the uncertainty on their faces mirroring his own. But there was no way to ignore the child's plea. No way to walk away. "Where's your brother?" Jackson asked softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Over there," she said, pointing toward the remnants of a nearby building, where a pile of debris had collapsed into what looked like a small shelter. "Please, you have to help him." Jackson motioned for his team to follow him as he moved toward the shelter. The girl trailed behind, holding her teddy bear close. When they reached the shelter, Jackson's heart dropped. The boy was lying on the ground, his body gaunt and pale. He looked no older than 6, his chest rising and falling shallowly, as if each breath took all his strength. His limbs were thin, practically skeletal, and his skin was marked with the signs of severe malnutrition. The girl dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his forehead. "Kale," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Kale, please wake up. These people, they'll help." The boy stirred slightly, but his eyes remained closed. Jackson could see the faint pulse in his neck, but it was weak, barely there. He knew the boy didn't have much time left. Kane moved closer, her expression tight with concern but also skepticism. "Captain, we need to focus. This could be a trap." But Jackson didn't respond. He was too focused on the child. His heart ached as he looked down at the boy, seeing the same fear, the same helplessness in his eyes that he had seen in the eyes of children back on Earth, children who had lost everything in the chaos of war. "We can't just leave them here," Jackson said, his voice firm. "They're not a threat." Kane didn't argue, but the tension was palpable. She glanced around, ever vigilant, as the rest of the team set up a perimeter, keeping their eyes on the surroundings. Jackson, meanwhile, knelt beside the boy. He took a deep breath and reached into his pack, pulling out a ration bar, one of the last few they had. He unwrapped it and offered it to the girl. "Take this," Jackson said, his voice calm. "It's not much, but it's all we have." The girl looked at him with wide eyes. "For him?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Jackson nodded. "For both of you." Tears welled in the girl's eyes, and she took the ration, breaking it in half and carefully feeding it to the boy. Her hands were gentle, tender, as though she were afraid that any sudden movement might cause him to shatter. For a moment, everything fell silent, except for the sound of the wind, the soft rustle of leaves in the distance. Jackson watched the girl and her brother, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had always known that being a soldier meant making tough choices. But this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something more, for compassion, for the future of these children, and perhaps for something even greater. Jackson watched as the girl fed her brother, Kale, the ration bar with shaky hands. The boy's breathing had become slightly steadier, but he still looked as though he was on the brink of collapse. Jackson could see the raw desperation in the girl's eyes, but there was something else too, a kind of quiet strength that made her seem older than her years. She wasn't just a frightened child, she was a survivor. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of dust and smoke. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jackson could feel the weight of the decision he had made, the choice to help these two aliens when every part of his training told him not to. There were strict protocols for dealing with extraterrestrial life forms, and none of them included offering food to potential threats. "Captain." Kane spoke softly from behind him, pulling Jackson's attention back to the present. She stood with her arms crossed, her face a mix of concern and suspicion. "We're violating orders. If command finds out, we're both in trouble." Jackson didn't immediately respond. He watched as the girl, Ilara, gently coaxed her brother to eat, wiping his mouth with the corner of her tattered sleeve. She didn't seem to notice the tension around them, her entire focus on Kale. "I know," Jackson said quietly, his voice almost lost to the wind. "But what else are we supposed to do? These aren't soldiers. They're not enemies." Kane exhaled slowly, as if considering his words. "I get it, Jackson. But we're at war. Our people are dying. The last thing we need is to invite more trouble." Jackson turned to face her, his expression hardening. "What if we're making the same mistake they made? What if we're so focused on fighting that we forget there are innocent lives out here, just like ours?" Kane's eyes flickered with something, an emotion Jackson couldn't quite place, but she didn't argue. She just shook her head and glanced over her shoulder. The rest of the team was keeping their distance, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. They were soldiers, trained to take action when danger was present, not to play the role of caretakers for alien children. "I'll stand watch," Kane said after a long pause. "But you're on your own with this?" Jackson nodded, grateful for her understanding, even if it wasn't entirely on his side. He turned his attention back to Ilara and Kale. The girl had finished feeding her brother the last bit of food, and now she was simply sitting beside him, holding his hand. She didn't say anything. She just looked up at Jackson, her expression still pleading, as though waiting for him to make the next move. "You did good," Jackson said to her quietly. "He's better, right?" Ilara nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jackson couldn't ignore. "He's just so tired. He used to run and play with me, before everything happened." Her voice wavered as she spoke, and she quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to hide the tears that threatened to fall. Jackson swallowed. He wasn't used to this, dealing with children in the midst of a war. In all his years of service, he'd seen people break, seen men and women who couldn't handle the horrors of battle, but this was different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about something deeper, about the lost innocence of these children, caught in a conflict that had nothing to do with them. "Where are your parents?" Jackson asked, his voice gentle but firm. "How did you end up out here alone?" Ilara's eyes flickered with grief, and she tightened her grip on Kale's hand. They're gone. The invaders. They came to our world. They bombed everything. I couldn't even bury them. There wasn't enough time." Her voice broke on the last word, and Jackson could see the weight of the loss in her eyes. She didn't need to say more. The pain was clear. Jackson clenched his jaw. He had seen too many families torn apart by war. Human families. Alien families. It didn't matter. War didn't discriminate. It took lives without mercy, without hesitation. "Do you have any other family?" he asked softly. Ilara shook her head, her long, dark hair falling into her face. "Just Kale and me. We've been running for weeks. Hiding. Trying to survive." The boy, Kale, stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to catch the light. He looked up at Jackson with those large, sad eyes, and Jackson could see the fear still lingering in them. But there was something else there too, a kind of curiosity, a silent question. "What's your name?" Kale asked in a hoarse voice, his words slow but clear. Jackson knelt beside him, his expression softening. Jackson Holt." Kale's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Jackson," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. Are you going to help us?" Jackson hesitated. He had already given them food, but this question was different. Helping wasn't as simple as giving someone a meal. He could tell that the siblings were already depending on him, and once that trust was placed in him, there was no taking it back. "We'll figure something out," Jackson said quietly, though he didn't know what that something was yet. He had no idea how to protect them, how to keep them safe, but he would try. He had to. He couldn't let these children fall through the cracks of a war that wasn't their fault. Ilara looked at him then, her eyes wide, hopeful. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson nodded, his expression firm. "I mean it. You're not alone anymore." The words felt heavy, but true. It was hard to tell her that they were not safe here, that the outpost was not a permanent sanctuary. But for now, they were safe. And that was all he could offer. "We have to move," Kane called out from a distance, breaking the quiet moment. "The enemy could be closing in. We can't stay here much longer." Jackson stood, his gaze lingering on the siblings for a moment longer. "Stay close," he told them, his voice now full of authority. "We're heading back to the outpost. It's the safest place for now." Ilara nodded, and Jackson saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. Kyle, still weak, clung to his sister, his steps unsteady as he tried to rise. "Can you walk?" Jackson asked gently. "I think so," Kyle whispered, though it was clear he was struggling. Without hesitation, Jackson bent down and lifted the boy into his arms. The child was light, fragile, like a bird that had been caught in a storm and was now trying to find its wings again. Jackson could feel the weight of the responsibility settle on him, but he didn't flinch. He had faced battles, made impossible decisions, and dealt with loss. But this was different. This wasn't about strategy or victory. This was about survival, not just for himself, but for the innocents he'd sworn to protect. As they began their trek back to the outpost, the wind howled around them, carrying the bitter cold of the night with it. Jackson kept his pace steady, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The enemy was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to destroy what little humanity had left. But for now, Jackson focused on the two children in his care. They had already lost so much, and he would be damned if he let them lose more. The journey back to the outpost felt longer than it should have. The wind had picked up, pushing against them with a cold bitterness that seemed to seep into their bones. Jackson kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Every shadow, every distant sound made him uneasy. The mission hadn't gone as planned, and now he was responsible for the lives of two alien children, children who, against all logic, he couldn't bring himself to abandon. Kale was still weak, his head resting against Jackson's chest as he carried him in his arms. The boy was barely awake now, his breathing shallow, and Jackson could feel the faint tremor of his frail body. Ilara walked beside him, her gaze fixed on the ground. But every so often, her eyes would flicker up to meet his, as if checking to see if he was still there. Still willing to help, Jackson wasn't sure what kept him going. He had no clear plan, no real idea of how to keep the siblings safe. He only knew that he couldn't let them fall into the hands of the enemy. They had been through enough. "Captain," Kane's voice crackled over the comms, breaking the silence. "I'm seeing movement on the perimeter. Looks like we're not the only ones out here." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he needed was enemy forces closing in, while he had two vulnerable children in tow. He glanced at Kane, who was positioned a few hundred yards ahead, her figure a dark silhouette against the pale sky. Her posture was tense, her rifle raised, scanning the surroundings. "Understood," Jackson replied, his voice low. "Got it. Stay safe," Kane said before cutting the line. Ilara looked up at Jackson, her eyes wide with concern. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. "Just some movement," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Don't worry. We're almost there." The outpost was within sight now, a cluster of concrete structures surrounded by tall walls and guarded checkpoints. It wasn't much, but it was the only safe haven they had. At least, that's what Jackson told himself. Inside those walls, they would be protected from the immediate threats outside, though he knew it wouldn't last forever. This war had no easy answers. Ilara's gaze lingered on the outpost, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Will we be safe there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson hesitated, unsure how to answer. "For now, yes," he said. "We'll figure out what to do next when we get inside." They reached the gates, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. Jackson could see the sentries on the walls, figures in dark uniforms, their faces obscured by helmets. They watched warily as Jackson and his team approached, the tension in the air palpable. "Captain Holt," one of the sentries called down, his voice muffled through the comm system. "You're late. What's the status?" "We've encountered civilians," Jackson said, his voice steady but firm. "I need them taken inside. They're not a threat, but they need medical attention." The sentry paused, and Jackson could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "Civilians?" the sentry repeated, as though testing the word. "Yes," Jackson replied, his tone unwavering. "I'll explain inside. Just open the gates." After a long moment, the gates creaked open, and Jackson moved forward with the two children in tow. His team followed closely behind, their weapons still raised. But Jackson could tell they were uneasy. They hadn't signed up for protecting refugees, especially not alien ones. It was hard for them to see past the uniform, past the fact that these were just children, and not enemy soldiers. As they passed through the gates, the sentries watched them closely, their expressions unreadable. Inside the compound, the hum of machines and the low murmur of voices echoed from the various buildings. The outpost wasn't large, but it was functional barracks for the soldiers, a medical bay, storage units, and a few communication hubs. It was the only thing standing between them and the chaos outside. Jackson motioned for his team to take the siblings to the medical bay, where the medic, Dr. Emily Harris, was waiting. She was a no-nonsense type of woman, always quick to act when it came to injuries. But Jackson could tell that even she wasn't sure how to approach the situation. Two alien children, both clearly suffering inside a human military base. The question of what to do next was one they all had to face. "Dr. Harris," Jackson said as they entered the medical bay, "we need help. They've been through hell." Dr. Harris looked at him, then at the children, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are they doing here?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "They're not enemies," Jackson replied, his tone firm. "They're just kids. They need food, rest, and medical care." Dr. Harris nodded, though her face was still tense. "All right, get them on the table. I'll run some diagnostics." Ilara didn't resist as Jackson helped her onto the medical table. Kale, still too weak to walk on his own, was placed gently beside her. Ilara held his hand tightly, her eyes never leaving him as doctor. Harris worked quickly, scanning their vitals and administering basic treatments. "They've been malnourished for days," Dr. Harris said after a moment, looking up at Jackson. "Severe dehydration, but nothing too unusual given the circumstances. They'll need more care than we can provide here, but they'll survive." Jackson let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said, relieved, though he knew it was only a temporary solution. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I didn't think anyone would help us." Jackson gave her a small smile. "You don't need to thank me. It's the right thing to do." The door to the medical bay opened, and Kane stepped inside. Her face was grim, her eyes focused on Jackson. "Captain, we have a problem," she said, her voice low. Jackson's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "They're coming," Kane replied. "The enemy. They've detected us." Jackson felt his heart race. He had known this day would come, knew that it was only a matter of time before the enemy caught up with them. But now, with two children in the compound, and no way to fully defend the outpost, things were more complicated than ever. "We'll have to hold the line," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. "We can't let them take the outpost. Not with the children here." "Well, detention off." "With the children here," Kane nodded. "I'll rally the troops. We're going to need every soldier we have." Jackson glanced over at Ilara and Kale, their faces pale but hopeful. They were safe for now. But how long would that last? How long could they survive in this world of violence and fear? He didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain: he would do everything in his power to protect them. To protect the innocence that still remained in the universe. no matter how broken it was. As Kane left to prepare for the coming battle, Jackson turned back to the children, his heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. They weren't just refugees, they were a symbol, a reminder of everything that humanity had lost, and everything they still had to fight for. "We're going to get through this," Jackson whispered to Ilara, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise or a hope. Ilara looked at him, her eyes filled with silent gratitude. She nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jackson saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The sky had darkened completely by the time Jackson and his team had fortified the outpost. The enemy was on their way, a fact that weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. The air around the compound felt thick, charged with the quiet anticipation of an incoming storm. But this wasn't a storm that could be weathered with shelter. This was a storm of violence, of destruction, and of survival. Jackson stood at the front gates, looking out into the vast, empty wasteland. The wind howled through the broken landscape, but it was the silence that unnerved him. It was too quiet. For all the damage that had been done to the world outside, it had been too quiet for too long. The enemy was coming, and the tension in the air seemed to sharpen with every passing second. Behind him, the outpost was on high alert. Soldiers moved with purpose, checking weapons, reinforcing barricades, and preparing for whatever was to come. Jackson's mind raced, running through the plans he had formed since the enemy had first been spotted. He didn't have much time, and he didn't have enough men. But what he did have was something precious, a reason to fight. He thought of Ilara and Kyle, the two alien children whose lives had been entrusted to him. They were no longer just innocent bystanders in this war. They had become his responsibility, a reason to hold the line no matter the cost. And though Jackson had seen too many battles to count, though he had faced down death countless times, this felt different. This was personal. "Captain Holt." Kane's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back into the present. She was standing at the gate, her eyes scanning the horizon with a look of sharp determination. "Anything?" Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the dread that churned in his gut. "Movement," she replied, her hand tightening around her rifle. "They're out there, Captain. I don't know how many, but they're closing in. It won't be long now." Jackson nodded grimly. "Get the team ready. We're going to need everyone." Kane turned and began to shout orders to the soldiers behind her. They were ready. They had to be. There was no other choice. The enemy would show no mercy. And Jackson knew that. He could only hope that, with the element of surprise, they could buy enough time for Ilara and Kale to be safely evacuated. He turned and walked back into the compound, his boots echoing on the concrete. Inside, Ilara and Kale were resting in the medical bay, surrounded by Dr. Harris and a few of the other soldiers. The boy, Kale, had regained some strength but was still too weak to move on his own. Ilara was sitting beside him, her eyes wide with fear as she held her brother's hand tightly. Jackson paused for a moment at the doorway, watching the two children. Ilara caught his gaze and smiled faintly. "We'll be all right, won't we?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Jackson stepped into the room, his expression softening. "We'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. He couldn't lie to her, not when he didn't know what the next few hours would bring. "Is Kale going to be okay?" Ilara asked, her eyes filled with concern as she looked down at her brother. Dr. Harris looked up, her expression serious, but not hopeless. "He's stable for now, but he'll need more care than we can provide here. If we don't get him to a proper medical facility soon, things could get worse." Jackson nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. "I'll make sure we get you both out of here. Just hold on. Jackson, just hold on." Ilara nodded, her grip on Kale's hand tightening as she looked at Jackson. "Thank you for everything." Jackson didn't respond at first. What could he say? There were no guarantees. He could promise them protection, but he couldn't promise they'd make it out alive. But he would do everything in his power to keep them safe. For as long as he was breathing, they would not face this alone. He turned and walked out of the medical bay, his heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility he carried. The soldiers were ready, moving into position. Kane and the others were already stationed at the perimeter, prepared to defend the walls. The time for talking was over. It was time for action. The first explosion shook the ground beneath them. It came without warning, a deafening sound that sent dust and debris flying into the air. The force of the blast rattled the walls of the outpost, and Jackson felt the heat of the explosion against his skin. It wasn't just a warning, it was the beginning. "Here they come!" Kane shouted from the comms, her voice a sharp command in the chaos. "All units, engage. Keep them at a distance." Jackson's pulse quickened, but his feet were steady. He ran toward the sound of the explosion, his weapon raised and ready. His team was in position, holding the walls as the enemy forces began to make their move. From the distance, Jackson could see the flicker of their figures, the shapes of their heavy armor moving toward them in the dark. There were too many. The odds were not in their favor, but Jackson wasn't thinking about the odds anymore. His thoughts were focused on Ilara and Kale, on keeping them alive. The rest didn't matter. "Not now. We have to hold them back," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "No matter what." Kane nodded, her expression hardened. "We won't let them through." The enemy advanced, firing in bursts. The first wave came in fast, their weapons loud and unforgiving. But Jackson and his team were ready. The soldiers on the walls returned fire, their shots echoing in the night air. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but Jackson focused on the task at hand. Each shot was a step closer to protecting the children, to keeping them safe. Jackson moved with the precision of a trained soldier, ducking behind cover and returning fire with practiced ease. His mind was sharp, his body moving on instinct. He had fought in battles before, but this was different. This was about survival, not just his own, but theirs. The ground shook again as another explosion hit, this time closer. Jackson gritted his teeth and continued to fight. There was no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. The enemy would not stop until they had taken the outpost, and Jackson was determined to make them pay for every inch they gained. Inside the compound, the sound of explosions and gunfire was distant but constant. Ilara and Kale were still in the medical bay, their safety dependent on Jackson's ability to hold the line. Jackson could only pray that the soldiers were doing their part, that they were strong enough to withstand the enemy's assault. "Captain, we've got a breach." Kane's voice came through the comms again, sharp and urgent. "They're in the outer walls." Jackson's stomach dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be prepared, to hold them off long enough to evacuate the children. But now, the enemy was inside, and time was running out. "We'll take them out at the gates," Jackson said, his voice cold with resolve. "Everyone, fall back to the inner perimeter. We can't let them reach the medical bay." The order was immediate, and Jackson led the charge, his team falling back to the core of the outpost. The enemy was relentless, pushing forward in waves. But Jackson's team fought with everything they had. They couldn't give up, not when lives were on the line. Jackson reached the medical bay just as the last of his team secured the outer walls. Ilara and Kale were still there, safe for now, but the fear in Ilara's eyes was unmistakable. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're holding them off," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Stay here and don't move. We'll get you to safety soon." Ilara nodded, but Jackson could see the fear still there, the same fear that had been in her eyes when they first met. He couldn't promise her safety. Not yet, but he could promise that he would fight until the very end. Outside, the battle raged on, but for Jackson, the fight was already clear. The outpost had to stand, and he would give everything to make sure it did. For the children, for humanity, for the future.